In the spring of 1972, in a hospital room in Champaign, Illinois, a dying farmer named Walter Hoffman called his two sons to his bedside and divided his life's work between them. 160 acres of prime Illinois farmland, black soil so rich you could grow corn in your sleep, land that had been in the Hoffman family since 1919, when Walter's father had bought it with savings from 20 years of railroad work. Walter was 64 years old, pancreatic cancer. The doctor said maybe a month left, maybe less. His wife had died 3 years earlier, and now there was nothing left but the land, the equipment, and two sons who had never agreed on anything in their lives. Dean was 30, the firstborn, tall, confident, always certain he was the smartest man in any room. He had ideas about farming, big ideas, expansion, modernization, the future. Carl was 26, the younger son, quieter, smaller, always in his brother's shadow. He didn't have ideas so much as instincts, and his instincts told him to listen more than he talked. Walter looked at his son standing on either side of his hospital bed, and he knew exactly what was going to happen after he died. They would fight. They always fought. And this time the fight would be about everything he'd spent his life building. So he made a decision. "I'm splitting the farm," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 80 acres each. Dean, you get the north half. Carl, you get the south. Dean nodded, already calculating. "That's fair. We can work it together, share equipment." "No," Walter's voice was firm despite its weakness. "You work your land, he works his. Separate. What you do with your 80 acres is your business. What he does with his is his." "Dad, that doesn't make sense. It's more efficient." "I know what's efficient, boy. I've been farming since before you were born." Walter closed his eyes for a moment. "You two can't work together. Never could, so don't try. Just farm your land. Make your own choices. Live with the consequences." Carl hadn't spoken. He was watching his father's face, seeing something there that Dean was too busy planning to notice. "Carl," Walter turned to his younger son, "stay a minute after your brother leaves. There's something I need to tell you." Dean's face darkened. "Why? What do you need to tell him that I can't hear?" "Because it's not for you. Go on now. I need to rest." Dean stood there for a moment, jaw tight, then turned and walked out. When they were alone, Walter reached out and took Carl's hand. "Listen to me," he said. "Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." And then Walter Hoffman told his younger son a story. Let me tell you about that story, because it explains everything that happened next. In 1933, Walter Hoffman was 25 years old. The Depression had hollowed out the Midwest like a disease. Corn that sold for $1 a bushel in 1929 was selling for 10 cents. Farmers who had borrowed money to expand during the good years were losing everything. Walter's father, Heinrich, had been one of them. Heinrich had bought extra land in 1927, convinced that prices would keep rising. He'd taken out a loan using the original farm as collateral. When the crash came, he couldn't make the payments. The bank foreclosed in the spring of 1933. But here's what Walter never told anyone, not even his wife. Heinrich didn't lose the farm to bad luck alone. He lost it partly to his own brother. Heinrich's brother, August, had married well, a banker's daughter from Springfield. When the bank was preparing to foreclose, August had the information before anyone else. He could have warned Heinrich, given him time to find another solution. Instead, August arranged to buy the farm at auction himself, using his wife's family money. Heinrich Hoffman watched his own brother buy his land out from under him for 40 cents on the dollar. The family never spoke again. Heinrich died 2 years later. Heartbreak, the doctor said, though Walter knew it was really shame. He'd lost his land to his own blood. Walter spent the next 15 years working as a tenant farmer, saving every penny, until he finally scraped together enough to buy the land back in 1948. He paid full price to August's widow. "I never borrowed $1 after that," Walter told Carl. "Never. Not when the neighbors were buying new equipment, not when the prices were good and everyone said expand. Never. Why didn't you tell Dean? Because Dean wouldn't understand. Dean thinks he's smarter than everyone who came before him. He thinks the old ways are stupid and the new ways are better. Walter's grip tightened. Dean is going to borrow money, Carl. He's going to expand. He's going to do everything I didn't do because he thinks I was a fool. What do you want me to do? I want you to keep the Farmall. Carl blinked. His father's 1952 Super M was the only tractor on the farm. It was 20 years old, simple and reliable, worth maybe $1,000 at auction. Your brother's going to want to sell it. Split the money, buy new equipment. Don't let him. That tractor's yours. It's paid for. It works. And as long as you have it, you don't need to borrow money for a new one. Dad, a 20-year-old tractor will do everything you need it to do. It's done everything I needed for 20 years. Walter's eyes were fierce now, burning with the last of his strength. The men who survive aren't the ones with the newest equipment. They're the ones with no debt. When hard times come, and they always come, the banks take the land from the men who owe them money. The men who owe nothing, they survive. I understand, Carl said. Promise me you won't borrow money, no matter what Dean does, no matter how much he laughs at you. I promise. Walter Hoffman smiled, the last real smile his son would ever see on his face. Good boy, he whispered. You were always the smart one, you just never knew it. He died 11 days later, and the war between his sons began. Let me tell you about the funeral, because that's when the mockery started. After the service, after the casseroles and the condolences, Dean and Carl stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse and began to divide their inheritance. The land was simple. The lawyer had already drawn up the split. The equipment was harder. The Farmall, Dean said, that's worth maybe $500 at auction. We split that. Buy something new. I've been looking at the John Deere 4020. It's got twice the horsepower, power steering, the works. I'm keeping the Farmall. Dean stared at his brother. What? I'm keeping it, it's not for sale. Carl, that tractor is 20 years old. It's a museum piece. The 4020 can do twice the work in half the time. I'm keeping the Farmall. You can have the rest of the equipment. The plow, the disc, the planter. I'll buy replacements as I need them. That's insane. We're supposed to split everything 50-50. Fine, figure out what the Farmall's worth. Subtract it from my share and give me the difference in cash. I'm keeping Dad's tractor. Dean's face had gone red. Did Dad put you up to this, that private conversation you had? Carl said nothing. He did. He told you to keep the damn tractor. Dean laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Of course he did. Dad never understood that farming has changed. You can't compete with a 20-year-old tractor. Maybe I don't want to compete. Maybe I just want to farm. Same thing. No, Dean, it's not. Dean shook his head. Fine. Keep your museum piece. I'm going to build something Dad never had the guts to build. And in 10 years, when I'm farming 1,000 acres and you're still puttering around on 80 with your antique tractor, don't come crying to me. He walked out, slamming the door behind him. Carl stood alone in the kitchen, looking out the window at the fields his father had worked for 40 years. The Farmall sat in the barn, patient and red, waiting for its new owner. I promised, Dad, Carl said quietly. I promised. Let me tell you about 1973, because that's when Dean made his first big move. 3 months after Walter's funeral, Dean drove to the John Deere dealership in Champaign and put a down payment on a brand new 4020. The price was $7,500, more money than Walter Hoffman had spent on equipment in the last decade of his life. Dean paid $2,000 down and financed the rest. The payments were $180 a month. Manageable, Dean figured, as long as corn prices stayed strong. And corn prices were strong. The Soviet Union had just made massive grain purchases. Export demand was booming. Farmers who had been struggling were suddenly making money hand over fist. Dean saw opportunity. He borrowed more. By the end of 1973, he had rented an additional 40 acres. By 1974, he had bought another 80 on credit, using his original land as collateral. By 1975, he was farming 200 acres and planning to expand further. Every time he drove past Carl's farm, every time he saw that faded red Farmall working the fields the same way it had for 20 years, Dean felt a mixture of pity and contempt. One Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1975, Dean stopped by Carl's farm. "Still running the old girl, I see," Dean said, nodding toward the Farmall parked by the barn. "Still runs fine. I could get you a good deal on a 40-20. You'd double your productivity." "I'm producing plenty." "Plenty isn't the same as profit. I cleared $12,000 last year. $12,000. What did you clear?" Carl was quiet for a moment. "Enough." "Enough?" Dean laughed. "That's your problem, little brother. You're satisfied with enough. Me, I want more. I want to build something Dad never had the vision to build." "Dad built plenty." "Dad was scared. Scared of debt. Scared of risk. Scared of everything. You know what he told me once? He said he'd rather farm 80 acres free and clear than 1,000 acres in debt. Can you imagine?" Carl looked at his brother, really looked at him. Dean was wearing new clothes, driving a new truck, talking about numbers and expansion and growth. He looked successful, but there was something in his eyes, a hunger that never got fed, a restlessness that never settled. "Dad knew what he was doing," Carl said quietly. "Dad was a coward." Dean climbed in his truck and drove away. Carl watched him go, then turned back to the Farmall. He ran his hand along the hood, feeling the sun-warmed metal, the chips and scratches of 20 years of honest work. "He doesn't understand, Dad, but I do. I promised I'll keep the promise." Have you ever watched someone you love make a mistake? Not a small one. The kind that takes years to play out, that you can see coming long before it arrives, but that you can't stop because they won't listen. That's what the next 10 years were like for Carl Hoffman. He watched his brother expand, watched Dean buy more land, more equipment, take on more debt, watched the new tractors arrive, the new trucks, the new combine, watched Dean build grain storage and hire workers, and watched the debt grow. What Dean didn't mention, what Carl learned from quiet conversations at the feed store and from the worried looks of bankers at church, was the other side of the ledger. The payments, the interest, the thin line between success and catastrophe. Carl kept his own numbers quiet. 80 acres, the same 80 acres his father had left him. One tractor, the same Farmall, now 30 years old, still running strong. No employees, no debt, no payments. He didn't make as much as Dean, not even close, but everything he made was his. In the spring of 1980, Carl made his last mortgage payment on the farmhouse. His father had carried a small note from when he'd rebuilt the kitchen in 1965. When that final payment cleared, Carl Hoffman owned everything on his farm outright. The land, the house, the equipment, every fence post, every grain of soil. He was 34 years old and he owed nothing to anyone. That same spring, Dean refinanced his operation. Interest rates were climbing. The prime rate hit 20% that year, and Dean's monthly payments had become crushing. He took out a new loan to pay off old loans, stretching his debt over more years at higher rates. He told himself it was temporary. Prices would come back. They always did. They didn't. The farm crisis of the 1980s didn't arrive all at once. It crept in like a slow disease, one bad year at a time. Interest rates spiked. Grain prices fell. Land values dropped. Farmers who had used land as collateral found themselves underwater, owing more than their farms were worth. The first foreclosures. Neighbors who had been farming for generations, suddenly gone. Equipment auctions every weekend. For sale signs on every county road. Dean Hoffman held on longer than most. He was smart and hardworking, and had started from a strong position. But smart and hardworking don't matter when you owe more than you can pay. By the spring of 1985, Dean was 6 months behind on his loans. The bank had sent letters, then warnings, then a man in a suit who sat in Dean's kitchen and explained in calm professional language that foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days. Dean sat in that kitchen and tried to understand how it had all gone wrong. He'd done everything right, expanded when prices were high, invested in efficient equipment, worked 18-hour days during planting and harvest, and none of it mattered. The prices were wrong, the interest rates were wrong, but the debt was real. Dean picked up the phone and made the hardest call of his life. "Carl, it's Dean. I need to talk to you." Carl drove to Dean's farmhouse that evening. Dean was sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. He'd been drinking, but he wasn't drunk, just tired, beaten. "I'm losing it," Dean said without preamble, "all of it. The land, the equipment, the house, the bank's foreclosing." Carl sat down across from him. "How bad?" "700,000. That's what I owe. The land's worth maybe half that now." Dean took a drink, his hand shaking slightly. "There's not going to be anything left, Carl. 20 years of work. Dad's land, the North 80 he left me. It's all going to auction." Carl was quiet for a long moment. "When's the auction?" "June. They're taking everything." Dean looked up at his brother, and there was something in his eyes Carl had never seen before. Fear, real fear. "Carl, I need to ask you something, and I know I don't have any right to ask. After everything I said, all those years of telling you that you were doing it wrong." "Just ask, Dean." "The North 80, Dad's original land." Dean's voice cracked. "I can't stand the thought of it going to strangers. Some corporation from Chicago that doesn't give a damn about what it means. It's been Hoffman land for 50 years. If you have any savings, anything you could use to buy it at auction, keep it in the family." Carl thought about the money he had saved. 15 years of careful living, never borrowing, never expanding. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. "How much do you think it'll go for?" "Maybe $400 an acre the way things are now. That's $32,000 for the 80. Carl nodded slowly. "I might be able to do that." Dean's face crumpled. "You do that, after everything I said?" "You're my brother, Dean. I laughed at you for 13 years. I told you that you were a fool, that Dad was a fool, that the Farmall was a museum piece. I know. Do you remember what Dad told me that day at the hospital? The private conversation you were so angry about?" "What?" "He told me about Grandpa Heinrich, about great-uncle August, about how August bought Heinrich's farm at auction in 1933 and the family never spoke again. Dad spent 15 years saving up to buy that land back. 15 years of being a tenant on land that should have been his. And you know what he said to me at the end?" Dean was staring at him. "He said, 'Don't let what happened to us happen to your brother. When the hard times come, and they always come, family has to stick together.'" Carl stood up. "I'll be at the auction, Dean. I'll buy the North 80. And when this is over, when you're back on your feet, we'll figure out a way to put the farm back together the way Dad would have wanted." Dean couldn't speak. He just sat there, tears on his face, as his younger brother walked out the door. The foreclosure sale was held on a Saturday morning in June, one of dozens of similar auctions that summer, the weekly ritual of watching families lose everything they'd built. Carl stood at the edge of the crowd beside his brother. He'd driven over that morning in his 1975 Ford, paid cash for 8 years ago. Not pretty, but his. The equipment went first. Dean's John Deere 4020, 13 years old now, worn but still valuable, sold for $4,200, a fraction of what Dean had paid. The combine, the trucks, the implements, all gone within 2 hours. Then came the land. "All right, folks. First parcel is 80 acres in Section 12. the northern parcel of the original Hoffman farm, prime farmland, black soil. Let's start the bidding at $300 an acre. A speculator from Chicago raised his paddle. 300, 350, 400. Carl raised his hand. 450. Heads turned. The crowd knew Carl. They knew he was the brother who had kept his father's ways, who was still farming 80 acres with a 30-year-old Farmall. What was he doing bidding on land? The speculator conferred with his partners. 500. Carl's heart was pounding. 500 an acre was $40,000. His entire savings was $38,000, scraped together over 15 years of careful living. He looked at Dean. Dean's face was gray. Carl thought about his father, about Heinrich losing his land to his own brother, about Walter spending 15 years trying to get it back, about the promise he'd made in that hospital room. 550, Carl said. The speculator frowned, going once at 550, going twice. Carl held his breath. Sold. His knees went weak. He didn't have $44,000. He had $38,000. Then a hand landed on his shoulder. I've got the other 6, a voice said. Carl turned. It was Harold Bennett, the farmer who owned the land south of his. 60 years old, weather-beaten, farming the same 300 acres since he was young. Harold, I can't. You can pay me back when you can. Harold's voice was gruff, but his eyes were kind. Your daddy helped me out in '68 when the floods took half my corn. Never asked for anything but a handshake. I figure this makes us even. Carl shook his hand, unable to speak. Behind him, Dean was weeping. By noon it was over. Dean Hoffman had lost everything, everything except the North 80, the original land, the Hoffman land. His brother had saved it. Carl took Dean in. The farmhouse was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, barely enough room for Carl alone. With Dean there, it was cramped and awkward and full of tension. The first months were hard. Dean was depressed, drinking too much, unable to see forward, but slowly something changed. Carl put Dean to work, not as a hired hand, as a partner. Equal shares, equal labor, equal say. They worked the combined 160 acres together using the 1952 Farmall Super M that Dean had once called a museum piece. It was 33 years old, older than Dean himself, but it still ran. It still pulled the plow, still did everything a tractor needed to do. One evening in the fall of 1986, after a long day of harvest, Dean and Carl sat on the porch drinking beer and watching the sunset over the fields. I was wrong, Dean said. Carl waited. About everything. About Dad, about the Farmall, about you, about all of it. I thought debt was just a tool like a plow or a tractor, something you used to get what you wanted, but it's not. It's a chain, and the longer you wear it, the heavier it gets. He looked at his brother. Dad tried to tell me, you tried to tell me, I wouldn't listen. You're listening now. I didn't have a choice. When you lose everything, you start to wonder if maybe you had it wrong all along. They sat in silence, watching the light fade over the fields. The same fields their father had worked. The same fields their grandfather had lost and their father had reclaimed. Carl, yeah, thank you for saving the land, for taking me in, for not giving up on me. Carl put a hand on his brother's shoulder. You're my brother, he said. That's what brothers do. In 1992, Carl sold Dean half the North 80, the land he'd bought at auction, for exactly what he'd paid. No interest, no profit, just a fair exchange that put the family farm back together the way it was always meant to be. The deed was registered at the county courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon in April, almost exactly 20 years after their father had died. You know what this means, Dean said, holding his copy of the new deed. What? We're partners now, real partners, equal shares in the whole 160. We've been partners for years, Dean. No, I mean legally, officially. Dean looked at the deed, then at his brother. Dad would be proud. Carl smiled. Dad would say, "We should stop talking and get back to work." Dean laughed, a real laugh, the first one Carl had heard from him in years. "You're right, he would. Let's go." They walked out of the courthouse together, two brothers who had taken different paths and ended up in the same place, the same land, the same work, the same simple truth their father had tried to teach them all along. The men who survive aren't the ones with the most. They're the ones who know what's enough. The 1952 Farmall Super M is still running, over 70 years old, one of the oldest working tractors in the county. Carl maintained it for decades. After Carl passed away in 2019, Dean took over its care. He's 82 years old and he still fires it up every spring just to hear it run. The John Deere 4020 that Dean bought in 1973, the one that was going to change everything, was sold at the foreclosure auction in 1985. It passed through several owners, was eventually parted out, and no longer exists as a complete machine. Dean's children and grandchildren farm the 160 acres now. They use modern equipment, a 2018 John Deere bought with cash from 3 years of savings. But they also keep the Farmall in the barn, maintained and ready, a reminder of where they came from. Every Thanksgiving, the whole family gathers at the farmhouse. Before dinner, Dean tells the story. He tells them about their grandfather Walter, who survived the Depression by never borrowing money. He tells them about his own pride and his catastrophic mistakes. He tells them about Carl, who kept a promise to their dying father and saved the family land when Dean couldn't save himself. And he tells them the lesson. The banks don't care about your dreams, Dean says. They don't care about your family or your history or how hard you worked. They care about their money. And if you owe them money, they own you. Doesn't matter how much land you have, how successful you look. If you're in debt, you're one bad year away from losing everything. He pauses, looking around the table. Your great-grandfather knew that. Your grandfather knew that. Uncle Carl knew that. It took me losing everything to learn it. He picks up his glass. To Carl, to Dad, to everyone who knew the truth and tried to teach it to those of us too stubborn to listen. The family drinks. And somewhere out in the barn, the 1952 Farmall Super M sits waiting. 70 years old, still ready to work. A museum piece, Dean once called it. He was wrong about that too. It's not a museum piece. It's a monument to patience, to wisdom, to the quiet strength of people who know that enough is enough, to two brothers who took different roads and found their way back to each other, to a family that survived. That's the real treasure in the end. Not the land, not the equipment, not the money. Family, forgiveness, a second chance. That's worth more than any empire.